You have a session titled, and I want to make sure I get this right here, What Web Pros Can Do to Thrive in a Post-Browser World. How do you define post-browser? What does that mean?
Well, I mean specifically general purpose web browsers. So, your square box on a desktop computer,
Sure.
and we sort of shrunk that down and we have it on mobile now, but I don't think that's good enough for mobile, and I think that you need special purpose web browsers on mobile, and the audience kind of agrees. That's why we have Facebook, which is displaying lots of web content, and Twitter and LinkedIn and Netflix and YouTube and all of these other special purpose web browsers that are sort of a native app that is definitely not a web browser, but is showing lots of web content.
Okay.
So that's the first step, and then the step after that is the next wave of devices that are going to be coming along that don't even have a general purpose web browser, maybe don't even have a screen, but are still things that people with web development skills are sort of uniquely positioned to build for because of the distributed architecture of the web, and we have a very high threshold, being web developers, we have a high threshold for difficulty, let's say.
Ambiguity.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
That's much better.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Which web skills do you feel like will be needed over the long term as these things evolve?
I think there are a few that are safe horses to bet on. Obviously, JavaScript is huge. It's everywhere. It'd be hard to go wrong by being a good JavaScript developer. Things like building APIs, I think, is going to be a very big deal. It's sort of become a big deal now with the mobile web, if you want to call it that. But it's going to be an even bigger deal as content gets consumed in our cars and our houses and on our wearables. So I think that building APIs can be a very big skill. And another one is CMSs. I think that in general, the notion of a CMS in the past 10 years or so has been very much a web publishing concept, and I think it really needs to be truly a content platform so that we can store agnostic, sort of context agnostic data in a way that I haven't really been seeing. So I think so lots of say WordPress. A lot of people use WordPress as a CMS, but it's specifically for output to a web page, even if that's a responsive web page. But what if the output environment is audio only? Or what if the output environment doesn't support CSS or JavaScript, or maybe even HTML? Maybe it's just a plain text environment. So things like adding lots of metadata, adding lots of different versions of text so that the client side can decide what to display. So maybe 3 different size headlines, like a tweet length, a short length, or an audio length. So the title of an article you might want to have it worded slightly differently if it's going to be played by Siri, for example.
Sure. So do you anticipate that developers would actually be creating those? It's almost like a custom CMS for different applications.
I think, yes, there's 2 things. I think that there's going to be space for a true CMS, if you will. But also, I think there's going to be work for years and years to come of sort of removing the pollution from existing content management systems.
Sure.
Pulling all the meta tags out of there, rich text, anything like that.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned wearables. What's your take on wearables and kind of more broadly just the Internet of Things? What do you expect to see happen in that space?
A lot. Yeah, I think a lot is going to go on there. I don't think it's. You sometimes hear people argue about, like the watches aren't going to replace phones. I agree that watches aren't going to replace phones, at least anytime soon. But I do think there is going to be an explosion, like a 10x explosion of chips in everything, because the popularity of the smartphone platform has an interesting side effect, which is that now very small, physically small, power efficient chips are available and sensors are available at very low cost because they're being manufactured at scale now. So, people who are makers are like looking at this pile of like really cool Lego blocks, like how can we put these together in new and interesting ways? And we've been hearing for a long time that everything's going to have a chip in it, but we're getting to the point where it's feasible from an economic sense to start doing that. So things like light bulbs and doorknobs, and it makes a lot of sense.
Kind of an odd question. What is the single biggest technical problem or issue you're facing right now?
I guess I would say being overwhelmed by the sort of flood of technology. There's no way to keep up with everything that's going on. So you kind of have to pick your battles and decide what you think is the thing you really want to focus on.
And the follow-up to that, what was the single biggest issue you were running into 5 years ago, and did it get resolved?
From a technical standpoint, I think so. From a technical standpoint, the problem was developing for both desktop and mobile. And 5 years ago, you said, what was that? 2000? Yeah, around then.
Yeah.
Around then, responsive web design really started to catch on back then. And
Yeah.
I think that has been largely solved. People would argue that, but I think that there are enough hooks in HTML5 and new CSS that you can actually deal with that.
Sure.
That problem was much harder to deal with back then.
Last question for you. What people or projects are you following these days?
From a very boots on the ground standpoint, I'm super interested in React, which is probably a lot of people would agree with that. It's the first thing that's happened in the front end, or really in my world of development. It's the first thing that I found really interesting in the last 5 years, since PhoneGap actually. And it's because they really question the underlying paradigms that we've kind of been using for the last 5 or 10 years about MVC and how, and sort of write once, run everywhere. They sort of turn that on its head, and it's like learn once, write everywhere. And as soon as I saw that, I was floored. I was like, wow, that's exactly what I should have been wishing for. So I'm super interested in React, but in the bigger picture, I'm following VR very closely. VR is absolutely mind-blowing, and that is definitely going to be in every house for sure. It is transformative. But I'm also in robots, drones, all this sort of future stuff. Anything that is sort of I'm really interested in this sort of cross-device interactions. Between a watch and a tablet and a TV and your car and your house. So I'm watching that space, but it's pretty vast. So I'm just sort of skipping along the surface, I guess.
Right. Well, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.